Hi, Grandma here, and I'm reading Tirzah, Chapter 11, Hidden Danger. Mary rubbed a small drop of precious oil across her dry, cracked lips. For days, the clouds had led them through terrible land barren of all but jagged hills. There was no water anywhere. She had given the last small portion of water to Hannah the night before. This camp was no better than any of the others had been, nothing but dry, hard ground. When would Yahweh bring them to water? With a sigh, she laid their mats on the tent floor. While she waited for Hannah to return from a visit to a neighboring woman, Mary sat under the open tent flap that formed a canopy overhead. She reached for her braid and undid it for the night, bending her head to comb the thick, dark tresses. Behind her waterfall of hair, she was unaware of the silent figure that stood watching her. Ram wanted to say something, let the girl know that he'd come, but the sight of the long, dark, silky hair that spilled into her lap like a robe kept him staring. He moved slightly, and in an instant she was on her feet. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to startle you," he stammered. "I found this, and I think it's yours." In his hand was the small carved bracelet. She knew it was hers. With burning cheeks, she took it from him. "I must have lost it the other day. Thank you for bringing it to me." Puzzled, she looked at him. "How knew you that it was mine?" Her slip of tongue into formal speech of her ancestors made her cheeks flush even hotter. "Easy. For one thing, I found it where you had been sitting on the rock. And for another, I figured that the carvings were Egyptian." He smiled at her, and she smiled back. "My Uncle Passer gave it to me when I first came to live in his house." She turned the bracelet around, searching for one of the carvings. "There," she said, pointing to what looked to Ram like a crude stick figure standing in an archway. "That one represents me entering my uncle's household." Ram nodded. "Yes, I see," he said. "Or think I do," he added. She laughed then, and he grinned. "Well, I'd better be off. I only came to return the bracelet to you." He hadn't meant to say that, but the words leaped out before he could stop them. His feet wouldn't obey him either. Awkwardly stumbling over a piece of firewood, he backed away from the tent and bolted off into the night. Ram was glad for the dark that wrapped itself around the camp. All he could think of was the girl and how transformed she was the last time he'd seen her, curled up on the rock crying. When she smiled, she was beautiful. She seemed to him like a vision, framed in the loveliest hair he'd ever seen. What was it that had made her cry? He wished he knew. With a start, Ram just realized he'd run past the path to his own tent, toward the broad plain, glowing faintly in the light from the fiery cloud above it. Here and there, rocks rose like dark, shadowy figures drawn by the empty night. He walked on toward the large outcrop of rock ahead of him. Somebody was playing a lyre. The sound came not from the direction of the camp behind him, but from the plain directly in front. Curious, Ram walked toward it. At the edge of the hill of rock, he stopped. Not far ahead was a mysterious player. Seated on a rock with his back to Ram, as the man began to sing, Ram stood transfixed. It was the voice of Moses. Softly he sang, "Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God." Ram's heart beat quickly. His feet made no sound as he stepped back and turned toward the camp. Behind him, the song continued. In the desert night, the words felt real to Ram. Yahweh watched over his people here now. All at once, Ram wanted nothing more than to sleep. Like a tired runner after a good race, he headed home. Most of the tents were dark, their owners asleep. With a frown, he looked toward his Uncle Shobal's tent, where a freshened fire blazed. In its light sat a group of at least a dozen men. What were they up to this time? Jonathan would report it all to him tomorrow. Tonight, Ram did not care. In the morning, the heat rose quickly. Ram let the goats to feed on the sparse, thorny stems of a tough desert plant that only they could stomach. Their thin hides clung so that he could see the shape of their knobby bones. A cloud of dust made him look up. It was Jonathan, running in spite of the thick heat. "Ram, come quickly. Some of the flocks have died and the people are ready to stone Moses." Jonathan stopped out of breath. Ram was on his feet instantly, his hand reaching for a knife and sling. "We must go to his aid at once." He scooped up a handful of stones and placed them into the pouch at his belt. Stunned disbelief covered Jonathan's face. "What are you saying, Ram? Don't you know that everyone is in agreement? This man Moses can no longer lead us. If we don't have water, we'll all die. Come on, man, think. We have to act like men here for the sake of the women and children." Jonathan's words were the words Ram had heard before from his uncle Shobal. Ram turned quickly toward the camp, calling back as he went, "My father and I will defend him to the death." This time Ram knew as he ran. There was no question in his mind. Moses was Yahweh's servant. How could they get to the promised land without him? In front of Moses and Aaron, the crowd stood listening in sullen silence. Ram saw his uncle Caleb, head and shoulders above those standing around him, and pushed his way to him. His uncle waved and made room to let him in. Moses and Aaron have called for the elders to walk on ahead of them to the place where God will provide water for the people. Afterward, we will all follow, Caleb said in a low voice. All the same, the mood of the people worries me. A mob like this can turn into an unreasoning beast. From the corner of his eye, Ram saw a short, thin man drop the fist-sized stone he had been holding. Surely they would not stone Moses and Aaron, not while he and his uncle Caleb stood by. If it should come to a fight, we'll be ready to stand against any who defy Yahweh's chosen, Ram declared. His uncle looked down, a smile on his broad face. "That's the spirit." Then his face grew serious. "How can they forget so soon the floggings and death that were our lot in Egypt?" The crowd was beginning to disperse. Putting a great hand on Ram's shoulder, Caleb guided him toward the tents. The air seemed thick with grumbling voices. Caleb kept his low as he spoke. "A free, thirsty man is 1,000 times better than a thirsty slave. Eh, Ram? We have not lost anyone to thirst or hunger. These bellyachers make me sick." Ram nodded, glad for his uncle's heavy, paw-like hand on his shoulder. What if his uncle Shobal had led his men to fight against the Egyptian army back at the Red Sea? What if they had died there because they did not wait for Yahweh? The thought was terrible. By late afternoon, Ram was watering the goats at the very place Moses had predicted. At the very place Moses had predicted Yahweh would provide water. One of the young goats nosed between two of the elders and was butted for his trouble. Ram guided him to a spot where he could drink. Tirzah led another youngster to an open place. Theirs were the last of the animals at the watering hole. Above them, the water fell in a steady stream from a crevice in the overhead rock. Carefully, Ram cupped a handful of the water, marveling at its coldness. Nahshon, elder of the tribe of Judah, had seen the water rush from the rock when Moses struck it with his rod. Ram brought his hand to his mouth and drank. It left a faintly earthy taste in his tongue. Tirzah came and knelt beside him, letting her hands float just beneath the surface of the water. It was a miracle, wasn't it? She raised her head to look at Ram. "It tastes like other water," she said, "but I keep thinking it shouldn't. I wish I could put some in a special jar and save it forever." Ram tweaked her nose with his wet hand. "Silly, it isn't the water. It's the way Yahweh provided it that's the miracle." Tirzah dried her wet hands and thought a minute. I think that the whole thing is a miracle, the water and the rock. The only thing I can't figure out is why Yahweh didn't give us water at each of the campsites." She turned to face her brother. Why didn't he, Ram? He could have. For what seemed a long while, Ram didn't answer. In the stillness, Tirzah could almost hear the desert listening. It was getting late, and the goats were beginning to circle restlessly. When he spoke, the words came slowly. Yahweh could have, Tiz, but we have bread, and none of us have died of thirst. I still don't understand, Tirzah insisted. Ram sent a pebble skipping across the water as he answered. What if we tried to do the whole thing alone? I mean, escape from Egypt and cross the desert. Oh, but that would be impossible, Tirzah said. In the first place, nobody could have made Pharaoh let us go. Ram nodded. Exactly. And what if Yahweh wanted to make it clear that he was behind the whole thing, that he was leading us? Again, Tirzah interrupted. But that is what he did. We have the cloud, and the Egyptian army is gone. All those things. I don't get it. Ram paused, his face clouded with effort. Look, he picked up a handful of rock and soil, held it in front of her. This is a wilderness we're crossing, not some lush garden, and Yahweh is the one who will take us through it. We won't ever forget that it was a desert. Tirzah nodded. Well, some might forget, but I don't think I would. A shadow crossed Ram's face, and he said, How do you know for sure? It's easier than you think, Tiz, to forget to trust Yahweh. I ought to know. Warmth rushed to Tirzah's cheeks. But you didn't, she stammered. I mean, you made a mistake, she finished meekly. Ram's face reddened. Remember it, Tiz. He turned to gaze at the hills. And another thing, he said abruptly, when trouble comes, that's the time to show your trust. Let's go. Quickly, he scooped up his staff, began calling the goats together. Tirzah stopped long enough to tighten her sandal strap. Before she could straighten up, she thought she saw something move on the hill to the west, like a flash in the red of the setting sun. Then another flash. She busied herself with her sandals, straining to see from the corner of her eye. Shields. The metal-studded shields of raiders. She could not tell how many, but with a sickening feeling in her stomach, she saw that the flashes spread in a line across the brow of the hill. The raiders must surely have seen the two of them. Safety lay ahead in the camp, if only they could reach it in time. Forcing herself not to look back, she walked swiftly after Ram. She must not call out or give any sign that she had seen them. As she caught up with him, Ram spoke sharply. Don't point or look back, he said. We're being watched by Bedouin. Then you saw them too. What can we do, Ram? Ram's voice was stern. Walk on as if we haven't seen anything. Just don't look back. Keep walking. It's our only chance to get back to camp. With all her strength, Tirzah forced herself to look straight ahead. Her legs were wooden, but she made them move to keep pace with Ram. As if he were out for an ordinary walk with goats, Ram prodded them, calling to one goat, then another to keep in line. Once he laughed a loud, long laugh and nodded his head to her while saying between his teeth, Keep walking, keep walking. Tirzah wished he would be still. How else could they hear if anyone was coming behind them? If only they hadn't stayed so long at the water. They were still out of sight of the camp in the hilly, rocky place. Was Yahweh watching? She strained her eyes for the cloud. So, what do you think? Well, I'll give you a clue of what I think, and that is the title of chapter 12 is War. So what do you think is going to happen? Well, I think the Bedouin are going to come down and they are going to try to fight the Israelis, and hopefully they have Yahweh on their side to protect them, like he did with the Egyptians. Bye-bye till next time.